responsibility for corporations and companies. And for companies, I see as actually quite a strong movement in big corporations to move on the issue of protection of human rights, of social standards, and to be more aware of actually what it is they are doing beyond their immediate the boundaries of their companies themselves. What is happening around it?
We're talking beyond ICT, and you're talking across
more general, right? Not only ICT, more general. Because I think ICT is just part of that. I mean, if you don't care how you pay your workers, you don't need to think about ICT. I think you need to look at it in a complete and holistic way. And I think what companies need to do is they need to sort of screen what are they actually doing, what is the impact of what they're doing, what is the human rights impact, the social impact, how are they impacting on communities around the fabrication sites and things like that. And I do see quite a few companies that, some work on it very seriously, some work on it, let's say, half seriously and half under public relations and reputation management issues. And there's a lot of companies that just say, it's not my issue. And that is something that we shouldn't accept. Because I think a corporation is a citizen as any other citizen and has the responsibility towards society and towards its own actions. Everybody is responsible for what he or she is doing, and that is true for corporations just as much.
And one of the keys, to throw it open now to the panel, and just anybody step in, one of the keys, has already been mentioned, is transparency. If, as you say, civil society has to step up and help politicians, corporations, and society at large navigate this, even though it's not a binary, this security freedom question, then if you don't have the information, it's very hard to know where to begin. And obviously, the absolute legal requirement to complete silence over FISA is at the heart of this. But there are many others, whether it is commercial confidence, legal confidence, licensing confidence, whatever. Who'd like to just offer some thoughts about how we can navigate our way through transparency?
I'm trying to bounce on what you just said. Times are changing basically. I've been at the CSR level in my company for the last 4 years, and I can see the changes. The time before and after, we had a lot of, if I take the transparency matter in terms of social inside the company, everything was secret a few years ago. Everything is in the open now. Reporting is the main rule of the company, and really, I can see that from our CEO also. Things are changing. They want to be transparent. They want to make the business a lot more sustainable, basically. So everything is changing. We are pushing as CSR. Of course, we are the most open people in the company, and we are training all the executives of the company to do so. And things are changing. Like we are ready to open many things that we were not supposed to open a few years ago. And everything in terms of human rights. I'm in charge of all reporting of the company, and there was absolutely nothing reported on human rights except that we've signed the convention and that we are applying human rights inside the company. And what we are doing with this industry dialogue is we need to set up a set of indicators that we will report and that we will ask to be audited on in order to be transparent. This is really the issue we do have.
And briefly, what are those individual points that you will be held up to your standard?
Well, coming back to our subject, when we are on the deal trying to get a new license somewhere in the country, we want, first of all, we've never been openly helping governments to make surveillance or whatsoever as a European or a French company at the origin. But since we're working now in 35 different countries all over the world, in Africa and Middle East, we want to make sure when we take a new license that both the government and us are clear that we will not go to get the license into things like putting up platforms for surveillance. So at least we would like to be completely open and to say say it, and to have also stakeholder dialogue with authority, industry, and civil society to make sure that those things are not written within our contracts. That's one example.
Is there a conversation about doing transparency reports?
It is the first time we have to experience it. We are waiting for a license in Burma, and we were asked from an international NGO to give transparency. You were the person. The deals.
Stand up, Human Rights Watch.
So I mean, it's amazing what your demand in the company made, and I really want to speak openly. It is not something we would have answered only a year ago. Okay, this is something we CSR wanted absolutely, but we could not on our own name answer. So we went back to the main management of the company, and we are going to get you answers. And this is a sign of opening. So thank you.
But just very briefly, before turning to others, to what degree, I mean, CSR departments of companies are there to be good and to show good.
Yeah.
What about the rest of the company and the traction of your...
That's what I'm saying. Time are changing. CSR is a lot more promoted to the head of the company. We are almost directly reporting to the CEO of the company, and he is the one who's pulsing. Beside all the stakeholder dialogue we're making to get the basic roots of what is CSR, depending what is a responsible company, what is a responsible telco, we have also the insight from the CEO, and that makes a huge difference.
Well, so I just wanted to ask you about this question of navigation within governments. So many governments, their foreign offices project the front door, which is internet freedom, anti-blocking, anti-filtering, go forth and multiply and have an open internet. Their security, home offices, interior offices, justice departments, the back door, as you've already alluded to, are pushing for more and more security. I mean, one could cite, many examples. UK government, the Dutch government, and its new, backdoor sort of snooping policy is pretty much in contradistinction, or is it? Are these two working completely against each other, tensions within government? How do you resolve this, where the advocates for open government and for application of the Ruggie principles are being sincere in what they're saying, it's just they're being contradicted by others?
I think there's actually even a third pole in this. On one side is in Germany it would be Development Ministry, Foreign Office, and also the Ministry of Justice, which considers itself very much a civil liberties ministry. And on the other side you would feel there would be Minister of the Interior, who's the security minister. And then the third pole is the Minister of Economics, who says, well, no extras on our companies because they need to make money, just leave them alone. No extra reporting, no extra this, no extra that. So it's like a triangle. And well, you describe it pretty well. I mean, let's say Foreign Office says, well, lift visa or free internet access to all and all of these things. We're there to push for the good things, so to say. But then it is an internal struggle. And sometimes we get there, sometimes we don't, sometimes it takes time. And one of the things I do, it's a constant struggle going on. There's a struggle going on right now between the Minister of Justice and the Minister of the Interior on whether, how much German Secret Service should invest on surveillance on the internet, how that should proceed. So, but it's a constant fight going on. And one of the things I'm trying to bring into the other agencies, especially into the Minister of Economic Movement, trying to tell him, listen, this is where it's going, trying to spearhead that movement, trying to push it, publicly support those companies that do report, that do respect human rights, and that advocate this kind of new economy. And well, he does. Sometimes he should do more about this, but it's new because traditional economic policies is about doing business. And I think it's very important that economic ministers learn to say, well, rule of law is essential to doing business. We need rule of law. We need a protecting internet. It's essential for doing good business. And to also have these messages with them when they travel to countries. But it's work. I guess it's the same in most European countries.
It's a big need.
freedom, new world, the internet, must not lead to gender. Must not lead to gender. And having something completely some on nowhere, of course. But again, the fear, and you said right when you said the civil society must stand up. The fear is that to bring internet to the classic and traditional and existing real world. So maybe it's something on between. But we are on the process of creating something, and I see it like in Tunisia when people are coming to a new way of life, to a new society, standing up after 30 or 50 years of problems. Of course, you will have a certain period where it's a jungle, where people cannot understand what is freedom, what is opening, what is doing, what they want to do, what the definition of what I want to do. But again, the big challenge is not to bring this internet and this world to the classic world. Otherwise, it will be again. I repeat, it's the most important thing.
Do you need the microphones for the film?
No,
for the TV. You need that.
Oh.
You need it.
No, we don't. No, we don't.
You don't need it.
No, Sybil.
If you need it for the sound for TV, for
Yes,
film, would
yes,
you
please.
prefer?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So just give us a few and we'll turn around. Keep that side. Right.
For the hope of a new world with more justice, with more social equity, we need to be, of course, very careful.
I just want to bring it before opening up to questions and observations from the floor. Just want to ask about the third principle, the access to remedy for victims of human rights abuses. That's an area we haven't yet touched upon. We talked about the obligations and responsibilities of states and companies. Who would like to talk about, in practical sense, solutions or improvements to access?
So from our research into the guides that we're just releasing, we found that the third pillar, especially in terms of freedom of expression and privacy, is probably the least developed in the ICT sector. That we find that companies may have internal mechanisms to deal with complaints about labour, or staff, or whistleblowers even. But in terms of a customer or a user who's had their privacy or freedom of expression violated, there is very little recourse, but there's very little channels for people to go and it to be a human rights issue like that to be escalated. So we feel like this is very much at the beginning of implementing the third pillar, and I'd be very interested to hear from Orange what they are, what they have in place for that. But
Marcus, you want to say something, and then Jeremy.
I just have to talk about an example which has nothing to do with ICT, but which is maybe can make the problem clear. We had this fire in Bangladesh a few weeks ago with 1,000 people dying. After that, there was a debate in the German media whether we should have the right of the victims of this fire to claim, to make a claim in the German court against one of the companies that ordered in this place. And I find that is a very difficult debate, because it means if you do that, you say, okay, you can make a claim against, I don't know, CNA or Zara, whoever, in Germany or in Spanish court. It also means at the same time that you say, well, we're giving up on Bangladesh justice anyway, because they don't have a chance to get something in Bangladesh where actually they should be able to claim. So I think that is very ambiguous and very difficult question to answer. And I think we need to make sure that we work in our development policy with developing judiciary in countries where the judiciary is weak or not working, because obviously that is, we're coming back to the first pillar, I mean that is the place where you need to claim, is the place where things happen. But then you run into the issue, okay, reforming the judiciary in Bangladesh is something which may take some time. What do you do in the meantime?
Thank you. Well, we now talk rather grandly about complaints mechanisms, but of course whistleblowing has been known for a very long time, has been instituted by many government agencies and certainly by the corporate world. Sometimes it's limited to people inside those agencies or inside the companies. Sometimes it's open to all. And gradually we've seen a change in whistleblowing from perhaps whistleblowing about wrong reporting, financial issues and so on, which was called for by the American changes in laws after the dot-com bubble, to now people being much more comfortable talking about harassment and gender issues and so on. So it's gradually catching up in this area, but it is very new, and it's very difficult for most people to get their minds around direct complaints about human rights abuses, because you're always talking about individuals, and it's you as an individual making that particular complaint. And as we see about the treatment of those who blow the whistle, it's not a very pleasant space to be in. So there are many problems around this, but just very shortly on GNI specifically, we are now looking about the need to set up our own complaints mechanism. It's quite a difficult issue to get our minds around, because of course we are an initiative which is a combination of these 4 sectors that I mentioned earlier. And so are we just a staging post for complaints against any of our members, or should we concentrate more on complaints about the integrity of GNI as an initiative and deal with problems which may arise from our own press statements, our own reporting, and so on. And we're making progress on this. We hope that we'll be in a situation where we can publish certainly something before the end of this year, and it will be open to the general public, not just obviously to those inside the companies and organisations which are our members.
Thank you. So with the following question, I'd just like to then now open it up to the audience for a broader discussion. Is the integrity and privacy of your telecom communications and your internet and social media communications a human right? If it is a human right, and if that human right is then potentially violated by a state surveilling it or somehow digging into your data and your contacts, if not your content, then do you have a redress? What is the form of that redress? Is the redress against the state? Is the redress against the company that was the intermediary to your communications? And how do we proceed from there? Or is it a competing right with security and therefore not a pure human right when it comes to this question of redress and access? That's just one of several questions. Do we have, we've got one microphone for questions or observations. Who'd like to start on either that or any other question to the panel or observation? Yeah. And I know a lot of people know a lot of people, but if everybody could announce themselves for those who don't know each other.
Sure. My name is Yochai Benedi. I'm the Policy Director at accessnet.org. I would say that there is absolutely sort of questions of human rights that are involved in surveillance, and particularly when telcos are instigated. And I think that this points to one of the sort of most tricky problems of human rights abuse that occurs incident to telecommunications operations, is that the abuses are often sort of at the behest of states. We understand from the guiding principles that both states and companies have a requirement or responsibility to provide effective access to remedy. And so I would say that responsibility certainly lies with both companies and the state itself. I would say that, particularly if we look within the U.S. government context, in terms of sort of giving broad sweeping immunization from liability for the telecom operators involved in these programs, that in effect denies users rights to remedy, and that is inherently problematic. I think that we often sort of confront this question of human rights versus sort of the need for security. And I think that we need to sort of, it's not this kind of dichotomy, that's a false dichotomy. We need to understand that the notion of due process underlies sort of the rights to freedom of expression, the rights to free assembly, and the rights of privacy and so forth. And that requires, you know, things like an adversarial hearing. It requires proportionality. It requires a legitimate aim. It requires legality. It requires that surveillance be adequate, that it has, you know, a purpose. And there's a number of principles that have been put together by a coalition of civil society groups, including my own organization, but also Privacy International, EFF, and so forth, that will be launching soon, that do sort of list out sort of what does sort of rights to respect communication surveillance law look like. That sort of, I think, gets at that sort of where do we, in a very pragmatic way, find that balance.
And will you or others be looking to propose means of seeking redress where those rights have been violated, if they have been violated?
So what would be sort of a mechanism for realizing them? So Access will be releasing an implementation guide probably next month that will sort of look at some of that in practice. The principles are available at necessaryandproportionate.org, I believe.
Right. Comments from now? Or let's move it to the next observation or point. Yes, in front.
Thanks. This is mostly for the human
Sorry,
rights.
so could you just announce something?
Sorry, Cynthia Wong, the Internet Researcher at Human Rights Watch. My question is mostly for the commissioner, but also I would love to get the thoughts of the rest of the panel. I'm just kind of curious as to what the discussion around corporate responsibility has been in Germany. And the more strategic question is, how do we make sure there is coherence among the various agencies and departments and ministries within any given government to make sure that you're speaking in one voice when it comes to human rights, right? So that you can get the trade and development and security agencies speaking in one voice. And the reason why I ask is that I think one of the biggest negative consequences of the PRISM revelation is that it's going to make it much more difficult for internet companies and telecom companies to push back against overbroad surveillance outside of the US and everywhere, right? So I think it's really important for Germany and the US and other countries to really get it right.
Well, I completely agree with you on this last one, because that's, I made a statement on PRISM saying exactly that there's two things without really looking into what PRISM does in detail, there's two things I didn't like about it. One is that a difference was being made between American citizens and others, and I don't like to be others. You know, I want to be treated with the same kind of respect as anybody else in the world. That's one thing. And the other thing, you know, the Russians and the Chinese are going to use this. And that is the same old story. That's why I'm highly frustrated with the Obama government, I must say, as a civil rights person, because I mean, whenever I say, you know, people should go to court, I hear Guantanamo. Whenever I say, you know, no targeted killing, you know, now it's prison, and it's so frustrating because it makes things so difficult for other people that work for human rights. I know that my colleagues in the Department of State have the same kind of comments. So I agree with you on that one. On the coherence one, that is an ongoing struggle. No, it's not that at the end, maybe you will have a decision on this topic or on that topic, but government always brings together different interest groups, just as Parliament does, and it's an ongoing struggle to balance these things and to fight for as much space for freedom and protection of civil liberties as you possibly can. And you know, if I would be the government just on my own, it would be easy, but that's not the way it is in a democratic society. I mean, there's many different people, and that's why I said this thing about civil liberties, because that's the strongest support I have in my work are civil rights groups outside that lobby Parliament, that lobby the government, that are out in the streets, that are vocal, and they're very, very important, because democratic governments tend to listen to these groups, and they tend to be susceptible for pressure, public pressure.
you want to, sorry, Chairman wants to.
Just like I can come back on part of Cynthia's question, which was really the coherence also across European countries in terms of corporate responsibility thinking. And generally speaking, particularly in the northern part of Europe, but increasingly now we see Italian companies, some Spanish companies really reaching state of the art in terms of reporting on corporate responsibility. So taking it very seriously indeed, and gradually, like France Telecom, Orange, with the CSR people and the people who are producing these reports rising up in the hierarchy to be taken more seriously. I think to come back to our real subject of today, what still needs to make huge progress is an understanding of the importance of human rights impact and human rights impact assessment and then reporting on it, because it really is, if you like, the last barrier in the area of corporate responsibility, which still needs to be tackled and taken seriously. And I think until John Ruggie and his team came along and really painted a scenario which was understandable by companies about what their responsibilities are, how they can report in this area, most senior business people, if asked what their responsibility to human rights was, would have said, well, we're not quite sure how relevant that is to us. So there's a huge progress that is in the process of being achieved at this moment in that particular area.
Hi, I'm Julie Blusset from Radio Netherlands Worldwide, and I just had a question to you, Global Network Initiative. There's a lot of companies that you are working with that seem to have participated in the NSA program. And then there's a company like Twitter, which is not part of the Global Network Initiative, which seems to not have participated. And I was just wondering what you think this says about the success of Global Network Initiative or the failure of it in some respects.
Well, it's a justified question. I think the difficulty is that we do understand from our company members, or the companies that are currently members, that they have tried and to some extent have succeeded in mitigating somewhat requests, but we're in the process, I explained that we're a multi-stakeholder dialogue, we're in the process of having a very robust dialogue. So you can imagine that our human rights NGO members, some of our investors, particularly our academics as well, are saying, you know, what precisely is the position? So we're also still in the situation where we need to understand better precisely what is the legal position under FISA, what are the prerogatives of the NSA, and so on. And we've gone the first stage, which is to have a very good lawyer actually spend an hour with the board members explaining what the background to the legal situation in the USA is. We had more questions at the end of that hour that we had of that legal briefing, so we're certainly not at the end of the road. But I think unless we as GNI, through the multi-stakeholder structure that we have, can come up with satisfactory answers to the kind of question that you've given, then obviously it will call into question the credibility. Remember too that we don't really know too much about the actual practice of some of our company members, just as we only hear what Twitter is saying. We just mean to say that we don't believe what we're hearing, but I think there's a lot of testing in practice that needs to be made before we can conclude that GNI members are performing perhaps worse than non-GNI members. But I'll leave it open. Rebecca may have some comments.
Thank you. I'm Rebecca McKinnon. I'm a troublemaker from the previous session. A couple of, one point and then a question. As a board member of GNI, and on the speaking to the Twitter question, we've had a lot of conversations with Twitter, and they do feel that they're doing the right thing without needing help from anyone else, and you know that's what they say. Certainly they have been doing things that appear that are the right things that we would like all companies to be doing. But a couple of points. One is that Twitter's going to make mistakes. It has made mistakes already around the Olympics in London. There were some issues. It's going to make more mistakes in the future because all companies make mistakes. That's inevitable. And one of the things that the GNI does is provides the framework for companies to work with human rights organizations and academics and others to anticipate where the problems are going to be in order to lessen the likelihood, anticipate and lessen the possibility that mistakes get made. So they are not benefiting from that. Also, now GNI is in its early days, and it's been through its first phase of assessments to confirm whether the first 3 founding companies have actually put into place policies that are in conformance with the GNI principles. The second phase of assessment will assess the extent to which they're actually putting these policies into practice, just in terms of concretely what they are doing. And Twitter, as a company that has not joined GNI, is basically just saying to the world, trust what we tell you we're doing. They are not participating in an independent third-party assessment that actually confirms whether or not the companies are actually doing what they say. So you can say, oh, well, Twitter is just so virtuous that they will always do what they say, but I've never heard of any entity that actually lives up to that. And so GNI is a mechanism for the public to actually get a sense of whether companies are, in fact, coming close to doing what they claim. And of course, no company is perfect, but organizations like Human Rights Watch, Human Rights in China, Index on Censorship, others would not be in this organization if they did not think this process was real. So that's just sort of a comment on Twitter, and I admire many of their people very much, but I think they may be a little bit short-sighted and perhaps a little arrogant about their ability to get everything right all the time as philosopher kings acting on their own. So, and then just kind of a question for the panel. At the moment, the number of companies on Earth that are making commitments publicly and actually taking concrete steps to live up to those commitments is a tiny minority of companies that have tremendous impact on people's digital lives. What is it going to take to get more companies to make concrete commitments, and not just lip service, but actually begin to put policies and practices into place? And what can civil society, governments here at the conference this week be doing to help move those companies that have not done anything yet or are afraid to make commitments? What can be done to help move them along?
Yeah, thanks. Really good questions. I think what's been unfortunate in the past about companies making human rights commitments is that they do it after they've made a huge mistake. And what we'd like to see is companies coming together. No one company can solve all the problems of human rights challenges they face alone. We do want to see companies coming together in initiatives like Industry Dialogue and GNI and committing to a process. Now, whether that's implementing the guiding principles, which is key steps that companies can follow, which will bring up the risks and challenges that companies face, and then not gives steps of how companies can begin to mitigate and remediate this. This is what we really want to see. In terms of what civil society can do, society should tell the government what they want to see, but we really want to see companies talking to civil society, especially companies that operate internationally. So European companies that operate internationally need to know the local context that's happening in the countries in which they operate. So they need to have links with local NGOs, not just the activists that come to conferences like this. They really need to reach out and make sure that they understand what's going on in that country. For example, I was in Kenya during the presidential elections, and for the local how they would get in contact with the executive Facebook.
Okay, also to answer the question, I would say that what we are doing in terms of corporate social responsibility and the involvement we have in doing good things and being transparent is part of the business now. And what will bring others to come will be competition. It is a competitive difference to be part of this kind of actions. We've opened the industry dialogue. We've opened a few years ago also what we call the Joint Audit Corporation for all our supply chain that we are working with in China and in India. There are people at the door of those two set of union that are trying to get in. It's very difficult because processes we have to work together are getting more and more difficult because we have too many companies trying to get, but basically everybody wants to be part of it, and we need to do that. This is part of the business. It may be cynical, but this is the way it goes.
Just two comments, if I may. What do we do to get more companies to take human rights issues, particularly in the ICT areas, more seriously? One is, I think governments can call for greater transparency. It's amazing how reporting, and I'm sure Eve would support that. If companies need to report something, then they have to put management systems in place to be able to report. And so it actually drives different behaviour, it improves behaviour. And why do I say governments calling for greater transparency? Because if governments call for many other things, then we get the famous unintended consequences of very much legislation and regulation. Whereas if you just call for reporting, that's relatively anodyne in terms of things that can go wrong, but it can be a powerful mover in the way companies report. And the final thing is a real pleading for a much, much bigger role for civil society, because ultimately we need to get all citizens not putting up with poor behaviour by the corporate world and to some extent, of course, by governments in many countries. And civil society can be a catalysing force to help that, because unless we get that pressure in so many areas where we want social change, it will not happen. So it's got to be that pressure bubbling up from people.
I think first remark is that guiding principles have only been there for 2 years now, so we should give it some time. And I think in these 2 years, a lot has actually happened. The second remark is that my work, I sometimes find that companies as well as government agencies actually perceive civil society activists as someone they should talk to. It's like, they're the enemy. So they're not used to talking to these people. And they see them as leftish, anti-state, anti-capitalistic, whatever, which may have been true for civil society 25 years ago, but which is not true anymore now. So we need to change views and habits in government agencies, but also in big corporations. And that's happening. I see it happening in big companies, big German companies that actually talk to civil society, because they understand that it makes a lot of sense for them to sort of tap on the know-how that's there, to tap on the know-how of people that they consider widows. In the meantime, civil society activists have professionalized, so to say, over the past 20 years in a great way, and companies start tapping on this know-how. But, it's going to take some time.
To have more corporate and more companies going into this field, it's also about economics. And when you give the example of Bangladesh, saying that what to do, and I saw that Benetton, Adidas, and Zara decided together to audit the companies with whom they're going to work. But then this leads to the raising on the price of production, and then they will competitivity, we will produce more expensively. So we have maybe to think about mechanisms to finance. We are talking about also having information systems to report. This is also will have costs, and then you will certainly have government saying yes, but our companies must make money. How to deal with that? And we come again to the question of economics. So maybe the solution would be universality. First of all, that means all countries belonging to the world, to the economic forum must, all the companies trading in this global world must have the same rules to work on, and through universal to find universal rules, maybe to reduce some example for people who are investing taxes, for people who are investing in to put in place all these mechanisms.
More questions, thoughts?
Hi, I'm Tom Kennedy. I work for the British Foreign Office, and we've been working on the Ruggie Principles for the past 2 years. And the British government is quite close to coming out with its strategy on business and human rights. We call it an action plan. So that's been a major challenge, and within that, it's really a first stab at the guiding principles and putting those into a government expression. It's something that will evolve and change as we go forward. But I think the challenges of the ICT sector, we see that as a whole new, the arrival of the internet has created a whole new industry area of commercial activity with its own implications, which are very sophisticated and complicated. So I congratulate the Institute of Human Rights and Business on the work they've done for the European Commission. I'm really impatient to see, if I have to wait till 5 o'clock to see those yeah. But I know that was very challenging, and I'm really interested to see how far down you've got. My understanding is it takes the guiding principles down to the coalface. Whether you've arrived there or not, I'm really interested to know about that. I agreed with the point that you made about, ideally the guiding principles would be taken up by every country around the world. And within that, as you look at Pillar 1, every country would then get its protection of human rights in order through its own legislation and all the rest of that. And a country like Bangladesh might not have that sophisticated a legislation on human rights issues at the moment. So there's a lot of onus still on countries like the UK.
Legislation, it's usually the implementation. Legislation.
Of course, you have to have implementation. So there's a lot of onus on countries like us in our expression of our expectations of companies to make very clear, what level of behaviour one does really expect, because actually in countries like that, there's no sort of local obligation or onus on them to act. Just the final comment I wanted to make, talking about companies and companies doing the right thing, and I think more companies are doing that. We're really seeing companies engaging. We're encouraging companies to be proactive in saying what they're doing on human rights, saying what they're doing with the Ruggie principles, but we're also encouraging civil society to give companies space to say what they're saying, and don't immediately leap on everything else that they've done wrong in the past. You've got to encourage companies. So it is a relationship between companies and civil society. And if we can work together, I think that is the obvious way to progress. Thanks.
Thank you. The organisers want each panel to come up with a few bullet points, and as this has been going on, I've come up with a few, and just to check that there's a broad consensus on the panel and more broadly in the room. One is to endorse the multi-stakeholder principle and to develop it, and to increase within that the role of civil society as notwithstanding Tom's point about giving space, but as an impetus for change and for adherence to the developing of the Ruggie principles. The second one is further work on improving and defining user access to remedy for violation of human rights in the ICT sector. And the third, and probably the easiest one, is a sea change in transparency in companies and in governance, and recommending further work, which I'm sure many panels will be doing in the course of these 2 days in that area. Are there any other? Well, you're right. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to.
Yes, do you want to? Should we wait for a microphone? Do you mind?
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm from the Association for Progressive Communications. And it's maybe a question or towards GNI. I guess what companies have done more effectively of late is to get an understanding around issues of freedom of expression, of privacy, and the kind of like how to engage with it as a framework, as a business. But where I see maybe there is a lack of expertise or familiarity is when this is applied through, say, for example, a gender perspective. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with what happened, the kind of campaign against Facebook, for example, around misogynistic hate speech that just took place a couple of weeks back. And this is about access to effective remedies and violations of human rights. And it's often presented as a kind of tension, freedom of expression versus the kind of like hate speech, for example. And when it comes to like misogynistic hate speech, how do you deal with this? And how then can companies also engage with, say, civil society? I know we talk about multi-stakeholder, but then there's also diversity within the different stakeholders themselves. So it's not just about the Ministry of Economy, for example, but it's also about the Ministry of Women. How do you bring in all of these different human rights standards into the conversations as well? So it's also about, say, for example, the Convention against the CEDAW Convention, so the Convention of Women, for example, and all of these things, like, to make sure that it's also trying to ready yourself to deal with particularly complex issues before they come, and then you're sort of like, oh no, how do we deal with this? Because really what we all want to sort of uphold is really putting this in a framework of human rights and not on a protectionist framework, which you can sometimes fall back into when we're not prepared or don't have the right people in the conversation.
Before Jeremy comes back on that, can I just check those three principles, those three thoughts that I outlined? Are they broadly in accordance with the discussions? Everybody broadly happy? Anybody would like to suggest something else? And then I'll ask Jeremy to come back on that specific question.
The only thing I would add, we haven't really talked about this yet, but just to put on the table is the issue of accountability when abuses do happen. Just one area I think that we're still trying to work out in the GNI. I think he's been the leader in this area. While I do agree with my colleague that we do want to be constructive when working with the companies, because I think the best solution is to prevent abuses before they happen. But at the same time, abuses will happen, and sometimes corporations weren't as responsible as they perhaps should have been, and there is a need to ensure accountability when that happens. Again, with transparency, a really key part of the equation, but it's not going to be enough when abuses do happen, and corporations have a responsibility to address those abuses. So that's the other thing I'd put on the table. How do we ensure accountability, if not through voluntary mechanisms?
So maybe, I mean, that's an extension of the access to remedy point.
Yes.
So put that as part of that.
We say that it shouldn't be just, first thing for that is the judiciary. If there's a breach of human rights or anything else, it's a question of people being taken to court, and we should leave that out. So if we talk about that, we should make reference to judicial well-working judiciary.
Yeah.
But I do think in order for that to happen, there does need to be a little more regulation at the national level, right? Because I think there is a lack of regulation that would actually allow that to happen in national courts.
In my experience, it's usually not a lack of regulation or legislation, it's usually a lack of courts, of well-working courts. That's usually the problem. Most of the countries we're thinking of have great legislation on whatever workers' protection and all of that, but they don't have the courts that can implement them. All people are afraid to go to the courts. So I think that's actually the point.
Do you want to just come on that?
Yeah.
And then I do want to make sure that Jeremy comes back on that.
And also just to add on that, this kind of comes back to civil society engagement as well, that violations of freedom of expression and privacy can be very hard to prove. Sometimes the evidence that's there is a lack of evidence that's documented. So back to civil society engagement, I would encourage civil society groups to put an emphasis on this, that in order for the judiciaries to be able to work, we need need to have more evidence for documentation of violations of freedom of expression.
Right. Any other broad points? Jeremy, do you want to just come back on the point about misogyny and hate speech and GNI's role?
Yes, thank you. The major focus of GNI is on government censorship and misuse of surveillance practices, so very central to what has been in the press and on radio and television over the last few days and hours. But of course, within our board, which is very strongly represented by some very strong women personalities, if I can put it like that, who we have enormous respect for, so that inevitably gender issues, to the extent that they are relevant to these two areas of censorship and surveillance of user information, will always be under discussion at our board meetings and in the other communications that we have. But it's not a major focus. It doesn't mean to say that collectively we don't think that these issues are very important, but our particular reason for coming together was to try to deal with censorship and surveillance issues. I must say that, of course, there are points where the two issues overlap. Having spent the weekend before last in Saudi Arabia, where one comes away with extraordinary feelings of unhappiness because of the way that society is organized and the way that all women are treated to our Western minds in a despicable way, which has almost nothing to do with religion, but with the domination of the male in that society. And interestingly, of course, there is almost no freedom of expression, and one of the best bloggers in that country has just been sentenced to 10 years in jail. So, of course, there are overlaps between this, and perhaps this is something that we should have a learning forum exercise on within GNI, just to raise the issue in terms of let's have another look at the relevance of these issues to some of the work that we're doing. So I think it's, I'm glad you brought up the issue.
Thank you. Does anybody have any final questions? Anybody on the panel have any final thoughts? If not, it's time for lunch, I think. And thank you for a very full discussion, and I hope we have succeeded in taking the issue forward for further legislation in the course of the next couple of days.